Thanks, George. Nice segment. Yeah, so we're dubbing Ham Nation December as Tower Safety Month. Now, it's not going to be the typical tower safety we show you. Jim Idelson, K1IR. Before I bring him on, I just want to give you a little background. But we're going to do this in a 3-part series, and he's done a lot of analytics behind it and where the problem really exists. Not just tower safety in general. So he's really going to take a deep dive here, and it's really something you want to tune in, play at your ham clubs and things like that. Now, Jim Idelson, K1IR, he's a long-time friend of mine and Jerry's, and also of Ham Nation. He's been active in the hobby since 1972. In all aspects of the hobby, kind of like me. He's from like public service to satellite to repeater operations. He climbed his first tower when he was 13, and he's going to kick off the 3-part series tonight on tower safety. And in this series, he's going to bring together his long experience with tower work and his passion for data analytics to bring new insight to this topic. So welcome, Jim.
Hey, Val. Thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm just going to let you run with this instead of a normal back and forth interview because we have so much to cover in these 3 segments. So just go ahead and take it away.
There is kind of a ton of slides and everything, and I'm sure people are going to be very interested in some of the stuff that they see today. This is a great opportunity. I really appreciate the offer that you made when you heard about the presentations that I was doing to local clubs on this question of tower safety. It's really taken off. A lot of people have expressed interest. People recognize that there's an issue and that we need to do something about it. So, as you said, over the course of the next 3 weeks, 3 sessions, we're going to kind of unveil the different aspects of this. The first one tonight that we're going to talk about is just the question of, do we have a problem here? And I'm going to peel away the layers of the onion and show you what I learned and give you a sense for where we are on this question. Okay. So first thing I should tell you is that my interest in this was really heightened. Although, over years we had heard of different issues in amateur radio tower work of injuries and the occasional fatality. And this is a problem that I really became sensitized to when a good friend, Paul Bittner, the Reverend Paul Bittner, W0AIH, out in Wisconsin, lost his life when he fell from one of his towers while he was doing some maintenance work. That happened a year ago in October. And then some time went by, and we lost another friend, a gentleman from New Hampshire. He was helping a friend of his take down a tower as his friend was preparing to move out of the area. And so 2 fatalities. So 2 fatalities in less than 1 year. This was a great source of concern for me. What I did was I sent an email out to my friends in the Yankee Clipper Contest Club. All of us, knew Paul. We were familiar with the challenges around tower climbing. Many of that group had some kind of issues in the past of their own. I got an email back from the president of the club. He said, "Hey, Jim, great topic. Why don't you do a presentation for our September meeting?" So it didn't take very long to figure out that doing a presentation on this topic was a worthwhile place to spend some of my time and energy. Okay, so what I wanted to do before figuring out what to say was to look at what others had already been doing. And there is a lot of great work that has been done and continues to be done in this area of tower safety within our community. A couple of things that you all may know about. If you don't, you should check into these. Steve Morris, KA7LXC, has written a book called Up the Tower. Lots of safety information in that. Another one of our friends, K4ZA, Don, has written extensively about towers and tower safety. He's presented on the topic in various forums, and he writes about it in his own blog. And finally, a face that's well known to everyone here at Ham Nation is Tim Duffy. Tim has been a stalwart on this topic. He's included it in his antenna forums at Dayton, and he comes on live here on Ham Nation every time one of these mishaps happens, and tries to help us remember the importance of being safe when we do work in antennas and tower work. Okay, so given that there is some activity, and there's a lot of information out there about the kind of nuts and bolts of what to do to be safe, I wanted to take a little different approach. So I decided to dive into the data that we have available on this topic and go through it and see what the data actually tells us. The first question we wanted to answer is this question of, do we have a problem? We know that and feel strongly, certainly when, if and when we lose one of our colleagues to a tower safety mishap. But the question is this problem of significance in terms of size and frequency that it's something that we really have to be worrying about? The second part is to, once we understand what those problems are and how the extent of them, if we can understand what's the underlying root causes and whether there are some systemic problems in the way we do this kind of work that lead us to excessive problems. And then finally, once we know what those problems are, what can we do about it? Okay, so the 3 weeks of the content that we're going to hear about will be structured pretty much in this way. This first week, we're going to just talk about, do we have a problem and how big is it? Okay, so next thing. You don't want to start a project until you find out if anybody else has already done a similar project. And it turns out in the commercial and professional tower climbing world, a big investigation was done back in 2012. It was done by PBS, Frontline, and ProPublica, an online investigative journalism group. And they were concerned about the possibility, or some feeling that they had, that the level of fatalities that were being experienced by those who were building and maintaining cell towers was above what it should be. And so they did a lot of investigation. They did turn up that was in fact true. And what I found from the research was that there was very interesting information that we could use, that I could use to help with the investigation that we were doing in our own community. The role of government, how to measure these fatality rates, some things about root causes and the role of standards. These are all things that were covered in their research and that we would find interesting to use in our own. Okay. So let's talk first about this government piece. This chart shows the U.S. Department of Labor. U.S. Department of Labor deals with everything that has to do with workplace. How many people work in different occupations? Where do they work? In what parts of the country, et cetera. On one side, on the left, you see OSHA. Everybody here is probably familiar with OSHA. OSHA handles safety in the workplace, and they provide standards, which they build the standards based on experience and what they've learned from injuries and fatalities that have happened in different types of occupations. They do investigations to understand what's going on, and they feed that information, what they learn, back into the standards that they roll out. And on the right side is this Bureau of Labor Statistics. They track everything. They track all the numbers. They track how many people in an occupation, where they work, and how much they get paid. But in addition, they work with OSHA to produce a report called the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries. This is interesting. What it is an annual report that shows the frequency of fatalities for each different occupation, all occupations, many occupations, so in a way that you can compare them and you can see which ones are more prone to injuries and fatalities than others. They do this by normalizing the numbers to the number of fatalities per 100,000 workers in whatever the occupation is. So just to give you a sense for where we are overall, across all occupations combined, we have a fatality rate of 3.6 per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers. Okay, that's not a prediction, and it doesn't tell you a lot or anything about any specific occupation, but overall, this is the rate. And by the way, just a footnote here, it doesn't include anything that was not an injury directly related to work. So if you, automobile accident on the way to work would not be included in this number. Now let's take a look at something of real interest. What was the fatality rate per 100,000 for the tower climbing industry? Okay, for professional commercial tower climbing. So the way they got to that is knowing that there were 300,000 commercial towers in the U.S., roughly, and about 5,000 total workers. And in that research that we looked at, it had fatality information from 2003 to 2011, about 9 years. And the average was about 10 fatalities per year. Okay, so when you run these numbers and calculate the fatality rate per 100,000, you get 199. Think about that in comparison to the 3.6 that we saw in the last slide. All right. Now, what we really want to do here is think about our own world in comparison to this commercial world. That's where I was heading with this. But how do we do that? Can we come up with a fatality rate for amateur radio tower climbing? It sounds difficult. So here's how it gets calculated. We know from that 12 months that we talked about earlier that there were at least two fatalities. But we need to figure out the full-time equivalent number of climbers in our community. So we need some way of doing that. Okay, so how many? Well, first of all, is anybody tracking this already? No chance. Can we just go out and ask a sample of the 800,000 licensees we have in the ham radio community in the U.S.? I don't think so. Very impractical and inaccurate. But there's an opportunity. We can build a model. So I want to talk to you next about a model that we built to figure out roughly how many tower climbers, equivalent tower climbers we have, full-time equivalent, that we have in the U.S. By the way, the concept of full-time equivalent is an important one here. If you and I both work in a profession and you and I both work half-time, okay, you and I both work 20 hours a week, together our 40 hours a week is one full-time equivalent. So as you can imagine, in the tower climbing world for ham radio operators, there are many, many operators, many climbers who together might make up one full-time equivalent. So that's the number we're trying to get to. So here's the model. If we could figure out roughly how many towers there are in the U.S. and multiply that number by the number of hours per tower per year of climbing time, okay, we would get a total number of hours of climbing time for all towers across the country. Okay, so that's the basic concept here. We would get a number of hours, and then we have to convert that to number of actual climbers or workers. And you do that by just dividing by the number of hours of work time in a year, which is roughly 2,000. Okay, for a single individual. Okay, so now we have to ask this question for that first piece of data. How many amateur radio towers are there in the U.S.? How are we going to figure that out? Again, is anybody tracking this? No way. Could we go out and visit a sample of the 800,000 ham QTHs in the U.S. and take a look and see how many have a tower? At first glance, at first thought, this sounds a daunting and an unreasonable thing to do. I thought about just doing it in town here, in my own town, just downloading the list of active licenses, the addresses, and driving around to each one and seeing if they had a tower. That would take a very long time. But there is a solution. And guess who provides the solution? It's Google. All right. Google has, as one of their many tools, Google Maps. So I popped my own address into Google Maps, and what do we see? There's my house on Morse Road. We can take comments on that later. And guess what? There's a tower in the backyard, easily visible. We took another sample here. This is an address that many of you are probably familiar with, 225 Main Street in Newington, Connecticut, headquarters of the American Radio Relay League. And guess what? We can see all their towers from above, no problem. But how many of these could we do quickly? It still was going to be a little bit difficult to download a whole bunch of addresses and do enough of a sample so that we could get a statistically valid estimate of the penetration rate of towers across our ham radio community. So what I did was I called a friend, Jerry, W1VE, and asked him if he thought we could build a software application to solve this problem. And he came up with it. We developed an application that we called Tower Finder. The goal of Tower Finder is to be able to quickly scroll through a list of call signs and immediately go to the Google Maps view of that call sign's address in the FCC ULS. All right. So we did this, and here's my QTH, K1IR, in the application. And there is clearly a tower there. Now we have added a whole list of several hundred QTHs in the left-hand column on the application, and you can see here's N3FCP, and you can see that it's the house with the brown roof, kind of down low, and no tower there. And so what we can do here is rather quickly go through a set of call signs and make a determination about whether there's a tower there. Now, we were pretty liberal about this. The one that we're looking at right now, you can see there's a white square in the corner of the house there, and there's what looks like a shadow, a dark shadow. We said, okay, that's a tower. All right, so we're trying not to miss some, even though they may be hard to see. Here's another one that's a little bit difficult to find. Just off the northwest corner of this house, you can see the faint outline of a tribander in the woods. Okay. All said and done, what we did was we took samples for each license class of a couple hundred call signs from each license class and went through them and came up with this ownership rate, this penetration rate of towers for that license class. And you can see extra class had the highest, general class was next, advanced, technician, and novice. Okay. Overall, the penetration rate was about 5%. And mapped against the full population of all licensees, 760,000 at that time, we came up with 37,918, which I will refer to as 38,000 towers. So there you go. Okay. So that was one of the numbers that we needed in order to do the climber estimate. The second number that we needed was an estimate of the amount of climbing time per tower per year. The number we decided to use was really, we came up with it very empirically. We talked to people. We discussed the goals of what we were trying to accomplish here. We wanted to use a number that was conservative, and a larger number would be conservative in this case. And we decided on the number 24 hours of climbing time per tower per year. As you know, very active hams are going to be climbing their towers frequently to make all kinds of antenna changes, fix things, etc. But there are thousands and thousands of towers across the country that have sat dormant, unused, unmodified, with a simple antenna system on them, and they stay there for years and require very, very little maintenance. So we went with this 24-hour number. Okay, now back to our original chart. We have 38,000 towers estimated. We have 24 hours per tower. And we have a total of almost 1 million hours in climber time per year. And then we divide that by the 2,000 hours, and there's our number, 456 equivalent, full-time equivalent tower climbers. So what's the next thing to do? Back to our discussion of commercial tower climbing fatality rate versus amateur. We've popped in all the numbers on the right that we just finished calculating. And using the 2 deaths that we were aware of in the last 12 months, that fatality rate is calculated at 439 versus the 199. That's a little more than twice the fatality rate. Okay, so this is significant and something that should concern us. However, there's more news, and it's not good news. That news is that we have to move Paul and Joe over, because in the course of doing the research, I learned about two other fatalities, Ken and Lee Parsons, who both passed away working on guide towers, and very, very sad, also during that same 12-month period. So the number was not 2, it was 4. And when we make that increase, it doubles that effective fatality rate against 100,000 against 100,000 to 878. So now we're talking about a 4x, 4 times level, which is very concerning. Okay. Last thing that I want to tell you about is another thing I wanted to do, just to change from looking at the commercial tower climbing piece of this as the only comparison. I decided to look at another activity that amateurs do as a hobby, and which is also considered by many to be somewhat risky. And that was skydiving. Okay, skydiving. So what is the fatality rate around skydiving? The U.S. Parachute Association is the organization that tracks and manages, in many ways, the skydiving activity of amateurs across the U.S. They do certifications, they do all kinds of things to help improve safety, but they also gather data. In 2018, they had recorded 13 fatalities associated directly with skydiving, and that was out of an estimated 3.3 million jumps that occurred in the U.S. in 2018. That gives us a rate for one fatality, we experienced one fatality out of a little more than 250,000 jumps. Okay. In the amateur tower climbing side of this, what we had to do was make an assumption that was an equivalent to a jump. So we went with the idea that a climb would be our equivalent of a jump. And so we took the 24 hours of climbing time and we said that it was essentially roughly 4 6-hour climbs per year. So that's like 1/4. Every 3 months, somebody does a climb. And so you multiply that number by 38,000, you get 152,000. Map that against the 4 fatalities that we had in the last year, and our number is 38,000. That's 7 times more frequent than the fatality rate in the skydiver world. So, what's the conclusion? I think the conclusion is that we do have a rather serious problem that we need to look at, and we will. We have a lot of information, and in next week's episode, we're going to start to drill down. And instead of looking at just statistical numbers here, we're going to look at what actually happened in all of these cases. This is the history of tower fatalities in our community since 2003. And as you can see from this chart that you're looking at right now, that trend is on the upswing. It was running around 1 per year, and now it's heading into a range of 2 a year. And this is something that should concern us, and we need to understand what's going on. So we will look at the types of accidents, we'll look at the root causes, and we'll look at what can be done to minimize those risks. So that's it for this week. I really appreciate everybody listening. I hope you'll have questions. I'd love to answer questions and hear your comments. And I hope you'll come back next week for the next session where we'll really dive into this. We're going to look at some pictures. We're going to look at some graphs and charts, talk about guide towers and self-supporting towers and all the different things that come into play in causing these kinds of accidents and injuries.
Well, thanks, Jim. Very in-depth analytics there. And yes, guide tower seems to be the major causes Jim and I were discussing earlier. So you definitely want to tune in, and we're going to talk about solutions for that as well. And you want to watch 2 and 3 coming up in the next 2 weeks. So we'll see you next week, Jim, and thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time and all the effort you put into this.
So, Jim, let's get to some questions here, and you might be discussing this in your further segments, but what about just becoming a certified tower climber? Would that set everybody's mind at ease about being able to do this kind of work, or just hiring out?
Yep. So there are lots of options. We all have different skills, and one of the things that we need to understand is that, even without additional training, et cetera, that you need to get to know yourself. And I have a lot of friends, I'm sure you do, who, have made a decision either to have something installed or not, and to make the commitment either to do their own tower work or only certain types of tower work that they feel comfortable with. Certainly, training is a great opportunity. There is lots of available commercial tower climbing training, and it covers many things. Covers everything from how to actually just climb to how to do rigging when you're putting equipment up and down a tower, and also safety, rescue. Rescue is another area that's covered. These are all very interesting and useful, but they're not inexpensive. One of the things that we think we ought to be doing in our community is developing a kind of certification model, certification and training that's appropriate for hams. And depending on the type of activity that you're doing in tower climbing, you might take a different course. So this is something that we're thinking about, and looks very interesting, and would be a great addition to the kind of resources that should be available to the everyday ham.
I believe that, and I really think that it should be sooner rather than later, and maybe even at Dayton having kind of the community come together to make a decision on this about how you're going to put up a tower and if you're actually qualified to do that. And I know that hurts people's feelings, and they're thinking, I can do this, but we've seen all these accidents, so we know that not everybody can do it or can no longer do it. You spend a whole lot more time on that tower on those belts. And that's the other thing is even my husband Jeff has faced this, where he's gotten climbing harnesses donated to him, but they're expired. You're not really supposed to be using those. Are you going to put on an expired motorcycle helmet and go down the road? Those are not safe actions. And I think that people don't think about those as much as they should. Don't you think, Jim?
Yes. So we need to have a set of standards for equipment that we use in amateur radio. Now, amateur radio is not commercial tower climbing. So we need to develop standards that are appropriate for us. We are not tower climbers every day, 24, doing, driving around the country doing this kind of work as an occupation. So we need to have standards that are appropriate for us. And that might be equipment standards. That's also should include procedures. The way we do the work is just as important as the equipment we use to be safe.
Absolutely. And talking about getting your statistics for your towers, there was a comment in the chat about, well, my tower is a tilt over, so I don't have to worry about that. Now, is that true?
Well, absolutely. First of all, you got to make sure you tilt it over. There are people I know that tilt over towers are tempting sometimes to climb. I've known people who have done that. Again, doing the safe thing, and it is true that a tilt over tower, assuming that it's well maintained and checked out properly before it is put into position for work, in other words, before it's tilted over. We have one example in the data set, which is a crank-up tower, in which the victim, actually this was not a fatality, but this person was very severely injured by a crank-up tower that fell, and the quoted reason for the failure was that the cable failed, the cable broke. Tilt-over tower may have that kind of mechanism on it as well. And so maintenance and proper operation of those things is an element that should be considered here. All of the fatalities that we're talking about, except for one, are falls. So they're all about climbing. If you're not climbing, you're at much less risk of serious injury than if you are actually on the tower, if you're just looking at the statistics that we have.
Oh, yeah. I think you should take in some other statistics, though. I was, again, helping Jeff put up the Christmas lights on our tower and wearing my hard hat, and it didn't quite fit me, and it kept falling off. And then all of a sudden, kerplunk, right next to me was the pull-up with, a carabiner on it and carabiner on it. And that could have put a big hole in my head if it had actually hit me. And then I said, I think I'm going to put this hard hat back on. So you don't think about all those things until something bad happens. So, Jim, it's been great for you to bring all of this up. And the only other thing I want to bring up is the one time a year kind of thing where there's a huge contest. We know we don't call it a contest, but it's field day. And a lot of people all of a sudden want to erect these towers, and they're not permanent. They're not guide. And what do you think about that? I'm so glad
you brought this one up. It comes up in the next week. We'll probably talk about field day. But one of the fatalities that we're talking about in that data set that we have is a field day fatality.
And it's very important.
Yes. And the way we handle field day, the way we handle de-expeditions, temporary installations are pretty risky if they're not done correctly. And so observing some rules of thumb around temporary installations is an important piece of the way we need to think going forward. I can tell you that there are many de-expedition groups now that do not permit any tower climbing on the de-expeditions that they fund, that they go on. Everything is done with crank ups and tilted masts and that sort of thing. One of the things, again, that I would mention as an example is the WRTC approach to towers. No one climbs anything. These are all tilted up using the falling derrick method, and it's very safe. There have been there were no issues around towers when we put up 65 towers in 2014.
Wow. And the only other thing I'll say about that, and again, back to certified climbing, is that when we do repeater stuff anymore, we're finding a lot more of the BLM and Forest Service sites are saying, you can't have a place here unless we know that there's going to be a certified tower climber, because they just don't want that on their record. They don't want those accidents. So that's what we're looking at. In the future, I think we'll see a lot more regulation on that. I know everybody, I'm sorry, but I think it's coming.
Yeah, I think, that's a place where we overlap with the commercial world, where it's in our own backyards. That regulation hasn't happened, but we need to get out ahead of that. That's my thinking, that in order to avoid problems of overreach of regulators, if we can get out ahead of this, get the problem more under control, and basically institute our own policies that we all feel good about following, I think that's the way to a good future for all of us.
I like looking forward to that for sure. And it's going to take people like you, Tim Duffy, a lot of his friends, and a whole lot of the community to be stern on this and to be harsh on the people that don't follow it. That's probably one of the biggest things. And I think that's what you're going to run into is how do we implement this now and get people to follow us.
We'll talk about that in session 3.
All right. See, I'm jumping the gun. All right. Well, Valerie, you did a great job by bringing Jim here tonight. We really appreciate it.